A Movement Tourist, Perspectives on Enjoying Movement and Physical Exercise. Written by Omer Saricicek. Narrated by Omer Saricicek. 5-word. Every cute book has a foreword. In fact, every book ever has a foreword, but none so far has had a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 word. The point of this book is to inspire philosophical reflection in your perceived paradigms of exercise and movement. And the first place to play with any paradigm is in the mind. This book contains a divulgence of first-person philosophy I've gained from years and years of experimenting with and enjoying sports, dance, and movement cultures. From my observations, there are far too many intelligent human being burgers falling victim to the self-imposed belief that they need to lose weight or want to get a six-pack or want to get shredded. Let me tell you, as a cute, shredded kid with a six-pack, I'm insecure, depressed, and lonely, just like you are. It will not change anything, at all. Six-packs don't make money or happiness. Happiness isn't an experience, it is a memory of laser beams firing across your stupid brain box. Prove me wrong, scientists. And the closest thing you'll experience to enjoyment in exercise is physical focus, or kinesthesis, sensation of your body. The purpose of this book is not to sell you a physical apparatus, nor to endorse supplements, nor to even tell you what exercises to do. Conversely, the purpose of this book is to provide a biased personal philosophy and perspective on the art of enjoying and immersing oneself in the wonders of physical exercise. Art, because it is a personal journey that cannot be replicated by anyone but you. And enjoying, because movement and exercise are so much more than a vector for your stupid goals, and you deserve to enjoy the vast complexity of your body while you have it. As such, rather than giving a human being a fish, let us give them a perspective instead, because let's face it, they may be a vegan like me, I'm vegan, and throw the fish away, but only a fool would throw perspective away. With all seriousness though, this book is short and Microsoft Suite just like my meat. I've organised it into 2 parts, bifurcating into 2 chapters, bifurcating into 2 concepts. It is less than 30 pages, so you can read it on a chill coffee moment or while commuting somewhere. There are different emboldened points emerging on each page to keep it interesting. Sincerely, if you pick any page at random, you'll see perspective from it. You'll also notice a context prompt at the end of each of the 8 concepts of the book, which is a call to action for you to stop reading and reflect on how the perspectives do or do not relate to your circumstances, and how they may or may not be useful to your movement and thus exercise behaviours. Yours sincerely, Omer Saricicek. Part 1. Philosophy of Movement. Chapter 1. Kaleidoscopic Perspective. In the year of writing this book in 2023, we, humanity, are living through a digital revolution. We are glued to the blue light of our electronic devices like fiendish moths to a flame that sedentarily burns our ego and corrupts our mind. Having said that, in spite of the plethora of negative mental and physical impacts that digital technology may have on us, it has enabled us to see the world at scale and vicariously share each other's perspectives, facilitating a shared global reality for the first time in history. It is incumbent, then, that each individual acutely philosophizes on the nature of this shared reality, reviewing how we frame our roles and relations through our biased worldviews. To do so, we may not merely look to the stars with a telescopic lens, nor invert our binoculars to see our friends as little tiny ant people. Instead, it is necessary to psychedelically, sober or otherwise, decompose our perceptions into kaleidoscopic fragments of what we believe or want to be true, in order to unveil and recompose the patterns of what is actually true. This is not only aptly relevant to the social and cognitive relationships we have through technology, but also in our relationship with movement and thus exercise. When children are encouraged to a particular sport, dance, or otherwise movement-based culture, they are often kinesthetically indoctrinated to the philosophy of that particular activity, rather than a philosophy of movement as the inquiry itself. The term philosophy of movement actually relates to the curious ancient Greeks in their snazzy gowns making bird shapes with the shadows of their hands while sipping old brew round a campfire. However, in this context, I'm referring to the ongoing question and physical inquiry into the nature of human kinesthesis, our sensorial ability to move and reason in 3-dimensional space. It is this philosophy of movement, I believe, that enables one to make physical discoveries and enjoy both the great scientific and artistic pleasures of physical exercise, i.e. movement. After all, it is our ability to ask questions and discover answers that enables us to be playful and curious as children. And there is no reason for the hide and seek to stop us adults, for as long as we seek, we shall find. Much like the view of the kaleidoscope, there is much to be seen in the realm of movement, if we open ourselves to the many perspectives outside of our own. Which brings me to the concept, meta-movement. Meta-movement as a term is a bit of a contradiction, because it is an attempt to label the unlabelable view of movement as a thing that can't and maybe shouldn't be labelled. That is, beyond its specific applications, e.g. punching, handstands, running, etc. Nonetheless, this concept holds great opportunity for categorizing the bigger view of movement and physical exercise that I argue makes it more curious and exciting, and it involves looking at movements as a combination of subjective and objective opportunity. Subjective being things that happen relative to you as an individual, and objective being things that are transferable, repeatable, and applicable to our shared reality. Because there is no single human on the planet with the same body as you and the same nervous system, there is literally nobody on the planet that can subjectively move exactly how you do. There are people, however, that have 2 arms and 2 legs, and in this case they can repeat and transfer physical concepts through the objective form of moving arms and legs, e.g. kicking a football or giving a high five. This objectivity is great for things like engineering because we can communicate concepts and make buildings consistently durable to earthquakes, but it is repetitive by its nature and therefore susceptible to being highly mentally disengaging in exercise. This is the issue with wanting to be fitter or comparing your body and or movement to other people. You're missing the subjectivity from the character of the context which you are in, and this encourages copycat movement culture rather than innovation, which again becomes disengaging and demotivating. You may be an amputee, you may be really fat, or you may be super short or weak, but the reality is you equals you. And if you seek to move in accordance with objective phenomena only, you will never have the great pleasure of experiencing the cinematic idiosyncrasies of your spectacular body. Conversely, if you only seek to move subjectively, you will suffer a great ignorance to the generational wisdom of the movers that came before you and the value of learning from them. Skill is the funnel through which passion is poured to create greatness, so disciplined practice is some part of it. But without personality, there can be no art in movement, and without art, the journey is oftentimes unentertaining. So to make exercise both enjoyable and maximally beneficial, I argue that it is necessary to see beyond the movement form and into how the movement relates to self and self-circumstances and opportunity. For example, when one is practicing boxing, practicing the orientation of a subjective set of feet, the relation of those feet with the environment is an objective relation with the physical world and universal laws of physics. Once these feet are applied to dancing, however, they are subject to a contextual variation of that relationship with the world and become a conduit for musical expression as opposed to a vehicle for combat. In order to transfer one movement practice to another context requires meta-movement, the application of movement patterns across kinesthetic contexts. This application can be implicit, unknown, or explicit, known, but in either case, deliberately reframing physical exercise and therefore movement as a form of self-discovery enables one to become a movement opportunist rather than a consumer, to appreciate both the generative process as well as the product. Empirically, this approach has proven to me to be the greatest way to become increasingly mobile and strong because of the excitement of both the movement, kinesthesis, and the way it can add itself to the repertoire of tools one has for physically playing with the objective and sometimes dull world. The self as a mover or kinesthetician is not an athlete, a fighter, or a dancer, but more so a player in a video game filled with opportunities to use one's toolkit to explore the vibrant emotional and physical landscapes. The meta-movement patterns I personally have taken from capoeira, I apply to dancing in clubs. The rotation dynamics I've taken from acrobatics I apply to taekwondo, and even the random moves I see old people do in the street form part of my kinesthetic reasoning or movement inquiry. All this is not to say that meta-movement is not occurring anyway when athletes change their sports or dancers their genre, but more so to inspire a deliberate reframing of all movement inquiry so that it can be reasoned with and creatively expressed across all contexts, to take the attention of its physical author from the laborious pain and suffering of exercise to the immersive joys of self-actualizing movement and play. Context. Before moving on to the second concept, movement and sociality, let us take a moment to recapitulate and reflect. We've considered the application of subjective and objective philosophical reasoning to movement, or better said, that which is unique, your emotional state, physical dimensions and situation, and that which is universal, the physical laws, arms and legs. We've considered the concept of meta-movement, our ability to take movement from one context to another, e.g. applying boxing footwork to dancing or vice versa. We've also considered the perspective of movements and meta-movement as a tool for self-actualizing play with the world. What I want you to do now is think about your unique circumstances and context. What is one subjective and one objective thing that affects your satisfaction from moving, e.g. mood state, weather, temperature? In what day-to-day activities do you engage in meta-movement patterns, e.g. washing dishes, washing hands? When was the last time you used movement to be playful, and what were you doing in the context? What's one thing you could do to put more of your personality into your movement and exercise? Movement sociality is the second concept we are going to look at. Sociality is crucial when it comes to exercise habits, and a lot of us like to deny its central importance in achieving our goals. We may like to believe that a lone wolf is a stronger wolf, but in reality, a lone wolf is a dead wolf. Saying that, is absolutely fine to exercise and move alone. In fact, it may be more beneficial to you based on the circumstances. However, we must consider sociality and solitude as core concepts for enjoying movement and thus exercise. When I use the term sociality, I'm referring to engaging in physical activity or otherwise with or around or for other people. Sociality does not necessarily require you to be in contact with another person, and may even be something as simple as attending a space in the presence of others or under the observation of others. For example, live streaming a workout online contains some element of sociality, owing to the fact that there are people observing, and from quantum physics to human behavior, there is an undoubted observer effect that takes place. It may be something as simple as considering the camera angle or brightness that encourages you to modulate your movement consciously or unconsciously. If this modulation is to assure your movement is visible to the observer, then this is in fact sociality changing your movement and thus exercise intention. The opposite end of the same spectrum, we have partner dancing such as kizomba, tango, or even the intensity of perreo and Jamaican daggering, which are basically dry humping on beat. All these involve close quarter contact and cooperation with another person and are highly social forms of movement and exercise. What implication does that have on enjoying exercise? Well, there are undoubted emotional effects from socializing and moreover touching each other that reshape the experience of movement and exercise. For example, when I'm feeling very social, I'm highly motivated to dance salsa in a highly social environment with other social agents. Because I'm feeling social, the movement serves as a vehicle for satiating my desire to be in contact with people, while being exercise generative. That is, I'm generating exercise as a side effect of sociality. Conversely, if I exercise in solitude, e.g. breakdancing alone in the street, this can sometimes become socially generative, i.e. people stop to engage and interact with me. In fact, I've developed some very beautiful and long-term relationships, friendships from exercising alone in the streets. A lot of the effects of sociality are very subtle, however, and they oftentimes go unnoticed. It may be something as subtle as a hormonal surge in the presence of attractive mates, embarrassment from public observation, or spatial restrictions from people in the environment, e.g. overcrowded class or gym. All of these factors, whether desired or undesired, have an important impact on the nature of our movement, either directly or indirectly. As such, they have an important impact on our exercise. This can be beneficial in certain contexts and disadvantageous in other contexts, all depending on our mood, our intentions, and our environment. For instance, if one is feeling sociable or wishes to socialize anyway, this approach to movement can be greatly beneficial for enjoying exercise by focusing on sociality. It is something that can even be leveraged in bizarre and peculiar ways. For example, if I'm honest enough with myself to recognize that being in the presence of others in a fitness class encourages me to push myself, show off, then I can focus on getting to a class if I'm lacking motivation, knowing that once I'm at the class, the social boundaries will keep me focused on the class and therefore the movement, and therefore the exercise. If I'm not feeling sociable and I do not wish to socialize but my motivation is high, I can elect for an activity that day that encourages solitude, e.g. home yoga. This can be useful where I might avoid the fitness class because of an antisocial mood and would prefer to be alone. Bringing us to solitude, referring to the perceived and actual absence of other people from the immediate environment that may affect any parameters relating to your movement and exercise, such as emotional state, spatial restriction, and interaction. Solitude, like sociality, can be advantageous and disadvantageous. Solitude can feel cripplingly lonesome or it can feel powerfully authentic. Moreover, it can be fundamentally confusing. If you subscribe to the Jungian notion that there are extroverted people and introverted people, you may be surprised to find that you are generally extroverted, social, but prefer to exercise alone. Or you may find that you are generally introverted, prefer solitude, but prefer to exercise with others. That is why it is important to seesaw, teeter-totter, and balance both sociality and solitude. For example, I generally enjoy practicing breakdancing alone because I feel able to fully express myself, be repetitive, and learn from making mistakes. I do not feel that it is conducive to a party setting for me to practice the same movement 100 times or to aggressively imitate kicking people in the head, so I refrain from breakdancing in overcrowded parties. However, when it comes to salsa dancing, I use my movement intelligence from both dances to play with my partner, and I transfer the meta movement patterns from breakdancing, which I practice 99% alone, to salsa, which I practice 1% alone. There is a great benefit then to organising one's movement practices around one's social tendencies and vice versa, as well as paying careful attention to the dynamic relationships between sociality and exercise. I believe that having both solitary and social movement practices is essential for a sustainable and enjoyable approach to exercise. The world is uncontrollable and uncertain events arise that either force us to be or not be social, or that shift our socio-emotional state at least. Being able to enjoy movement both socially and solitarily ensures we remain active even when half of our motivational resources are lost. It also means that we can leverage our physical fitness to develop our social fitness, or our social fitness to develop our physical fitness. For example, using solitarily learned dance moves to connect with other people, or attending novel physical activities to connect non-verbally with our friends or social peers. Context. We've considered the role of movement sociality, that is practicing movement alone and in social contexts. Now I want you to ask yourself, what is one type of movement you enjoy doing alone? This could be anything in or outside of sport, for example walking, sweeping the floor, cycling, etc. What is one type of movement you enjoy doing with or around people, again in or out of sport context? When was the last time you used a physical activity in order to socialize, and what was it doing, e.g. joining a walking group to meet people? Chapter 2. Emotion Regulation. This book is about perspective, and the beauty of perspective is that it can neither be wrong nor right, it just is, and that's okay. There are a lot of times it may be necessary to compartmentalize our emotions to deal with the situation at hand. In the case of extreme danger, we cannot resign to comfort if our resignation to such comfort yields our immediate demise. For example, if one is in a sinking ship, it's probably better to depart from said ship, no matter how uncomfortable, before proceeding to take a selfie and sink to Nemo HQ. Compartmentalizing emotions comes with a cost, however, and those repressed emotions often surface in inappropriate and maladaptive ways. This is commonly seen in ex-military or emergency service folks, who may find a plethora of unprocessed emotions surfacing while walking through a supermarket or having dinner with loved ones at a restaurant. They re-experience trauma, but in normal mundane situations, and that is a problem. It is therefore incumbent that we address our emotions as soon as possible. That is not to succumb to every temptation or avoid everything that makes us feel uncomfortable. However, it is to say that in order to enjoy movement, and thus our lives, we must have a certain degree of emotional awareness and self-management, emotional intelligence. Movement as a therapy is the third concept and a very important phenomenon when it comes to enjoying exercise. It is something often neglected by those in pursuit of reward. However important a goal may feel, it is a sense of reward that drives us to achieving them. And however enjoyable reward may feel, it is no comparison to relief. What is meant by relief in movement and exercise? Well, on a hot summer day, you've experienced that thirst quenching first sip of cold water after a long walk. On a cold winter day, you've experienced that first step into a warm room, and the relief accompanying it as you sit down to retire from movement. Anyone who can remember experiencing either of these discomfort scenarios will know that there is a beautiful sensation that comes from the amelioration of such pains, relief. When we move our bodies and thus exercise, we are compromising our physiology. We're tearing our muscles and putting our body through physical stress. There is nothing about that suffering by and of itself that can be savoured by a non-masochistic human. However, there is everything about it that can be savoured from its following cessation. When we learn of the great and gratifying feeling that is relief, we can exploit it in our movement for both physiological and psychological benefits. The point of this section is to share some perspective on that experience. For example, in my personal experience, swimming underwater is a very difficult exercise. Practicing this exercise deprives my body of oxygen, hypoxia, and makes me feel quite literally awful. But this is the therapy and the emotional benefit in itself. It is in the absolute trauma of being unable to breathe and the following hyperventilation when surfacing that literally taking in just one breath at the surface makes me immediately forget about all and any of the problems in my life. When you can't breathe, nothing else matters but breathing, and when you get that breath, the relief is astronomical. I know a lot of people are unable to motivate themselves to move, exercise, to that degree of intensity, but it is worth reflecting on the idea that there are activities out there that will endure such suffering that you will actually benefit from the suffering itself, and also the benefits of having exercised. That is, in the moments of suffering, you will be deprived of attentional resources to devote to your personal problems, and you will simultaneously benefit from the relief after the exercise, as well as the aesthetic benefits of a strong and healthy body. I cannot advocate that the mover or kinesthetician apply this ethos to every physical activity, for if you're dancing, it's probably maladaptive to seek suffering. However, it is just one approach to movement and exercise and is worth applying to certain domains. I, for example, apply this approach to swimming, as the stress it induces helps me forget about my plethora of personal problems. I do not apply it to social dancing, salsa, because it feels maladaptive to seek suffering from dancing with someone. As such, the way one approaches emotionality in movement and thus exercise can be adaptive and different depending on the context. Entering a state of movement with only one intention and refusing to adapt is like saying the same thing to 20 strangers at a party and expecting to have the same response. Your emotions are constantly adjusting, and so it is important to recognize that and leverage it as an opportunity in your movement. For example, if you're having a bad day, maybe the suffering of swimming underwater will provide you with a healthy respite from your problems and relieve you emotionally to more effectively deal with them. Conversely, if you're having a great day, dancing to music you love or playing sport with friends might provide you with the emotional reward to sustain that high and continue moving. Reward as such is also instrumental in the continuity of movement practice and enjoying exercise. It is easy to neglect the benefits of suffering and relief because it is difficult to begin pursuits in which they are involved. Nonetheless, it is an incredible feeling and one that becomes productively addictive. In the many cases, however, where the motivation to engage in such arduous exercise is lacking, it can be more productive to begin with reward mechanisms. Unfortunately, reward mechanisms are often the starting and stopping point for enjoying movement, and I believe this may be because not many people understand the basic neuropsychology of the way we respond to reward. If I'm being honest, neither do I, but from my empirical observations, it is a lot more difficult to increase reward than it is to increase relief. To increase relief requires only that we do stuff that challenges us insofar that we want to stop them, and progressively push the boat further out each time. However, when our brain is rewarding us, this reward has to eventually stop once a goal is achieved. Otherwise, we would be motivated to infinitely refine our teeth brushing abilities and lack prioritization to execute other tasks like cooking. Therefore, in order to sustain the rewarding mechanisms, we must continuously deviate from our expectations by adapting our movement and learning new things. Note that I'm not talking about the extrinsic rewards such as money or chocolate, but specifically about intrinsic feelings. An obvious yet cliche example being sexual intimacy. Maybe you've never experienced that or it's been a long time, but most people seeking sex do not quantify the calories they are burning, nor are they always seeking pain and relief. Oftentimes, it is the rewarding gratification that drives the activity beyond reproductive means. If you have sex in the same way at the same time with the same person, eventually you'll be bored of the regimen, because you will know what to expect, and that applies also to movement. If you want to feel emotionally gratified by movement, you probably need to switch things up. This could be socially, in which case you may or may not benefit from socio-emotional benefits too, or solitary, if you prefer. For example, I like dancing to music because there are an infinite number of ways you can move to the same song, or an infinite number of songs you can move to. Trying variations of movement patterns or executing them to different beats keeps my brain stimulated by the novelty of change and provides a fun and anti-complacent way of moving and thus exercising. Alternatively, practicing martial arts, sparring with different people is another great way to generate novelty, as predicting the other person's movement is a game of uncertainty and an immersive challenge of expectation and prediction. Note that expectation and prediction are not the most fun sounding terms to describe reward, but remember in the foreword I said the closest thing we can find to enjoyment is focus. There is no better way to focus than to be immersively and interactively exposed to novelty and risk, and without one single scientific proposition, I can prove this by merely asking you how many times you counted the number of content items you scrolled past on social media, or how long you spent on each repetition that you scrolled through. If like me you are so focused on the content that you lose track of the behavior itself, you're experiencing micro-incentive rewards in the form of novelty. Each post could be better or worse than the last one, but the main fact is that it is different, and because it is different, it stimulates curiosity and motivational reward. Escaping the doom and gloom of social media, however, we can readily apply the same mechanism to movement and thus exercise. For example, if you get bored of going to the gym, you can ask yourself if you're really bored of going to the gym or you're bored of what you do there. Are you excited by sitting on a metro seat staring at a phone screen? Are you excited by what it is showing you? Readily, we flee from that which bores us, but seldom do we explore why. Maybe you go to the same gym every day, and that is why you cease to enjoy moving there. Maybe you do the same movements every day, and that is why you are bored of moving there. These are two different realities that should not be conflated, and both can be adapted to explore greater reward functions. Switching or going to other gyms might provide curious stimulation if, like me, you were inspired by the environment. Alternatively, doing different activities there might provide a curious stimulatory reward if you are bored of your existing movement patterns there. I strongly encourage you to reflect on both the benefits of suffering and relief and the benefits of playing with reward at the behavioral and sensorial level when it comes to movement. Context. We've considered the benefits of suffering and relief and the benefits of playing with intrinsic behavioral reward at the sensorial level. Now, how can these perspectives be useful to your particular context, if they can be? I want you to ask yourself, when was the last time you felt so physically challenged that you couldn't think about any of your personal problems? When was the last time you felt so physically challenged that you enjoyed the relief of stopping? And is that something you could incorporate into a healthy movement practice? What are a few things that stimulate your curiosity to move? It could be music, environment, people, etc. Neuroscience and biomechanics are a whole other can of worms that I would like to introduce as the fifth concept. Neuroscience refers to the scientific, that is, theoretical and experimental pursuit of knowledge in the realm of our brain and spinal cord, i.e. nervous system. Biomechanics refers to the study of movement and physical laws related to how living organisms move. Unlike most authors or movement exercise enthusiasts, or with varying degrees of integrity and understanding, I would like to say that whatever I think I know about these topics is almost certainly outdated, biased, or grossly inaccurate. I say that not because I'm lazy, but because I read so much of the literature that I know how important it is to not miseducate people. There are no facts in science, there are only least disproved hypotheses. That means things which have been proven wrong less times. For something to be established as a fact, it must continue until the end of the universe, because that is the only way we can ensure that it never changes. People who truly respect science and engineering understand that there is no right, there is only less wrong. As such, it is pivotal that you take your movement and exercise related queries and do your own research. What I will do in this section, however, is provide you with a very simplified way of structuring questions that might be useful, and I would deem it generally useful to separate a question into two types based on an analogy to computer programming languages. In computer programming, the languages that interact closely with the physical body parts of the computer are called low-level languages, while the languages that affect your Facebook page are called high-level languages, in terms of how highly abstract they are. When it comes to the curious mind researching neuroscience and biomechanics of movement, it can be greatly useful to thus separate questions into both high-level and low-level questions. question because a leg in itself is made up of many parts and is quite an abstract construct that varies between different animals and even different people. Flexibility is also an abstract concept, as it must be relative to something that is less or more flexible. Asking high-level questions is particularly useful for discovering high-level solutions. For example, if your hips are not as mobile as you would like them to be, it may be possible that there is a solution that can increase the mobility of your hips and simultaneously increase the flexibility in your legs. These high-level solutions are thus a compounding of benefits and undoubtedly of great use to your movement and exercise needs. However, they do come with the downside that they are not specific, and so in cases where the problem is more nuanced than general leg flexibility, it may be necessary to ask lower-level questions and ask for more specific solutions. For example, how can I increase the flexibility of my lower legs? This is still fairly general, but if the problem is in the lower legs, this question removes all possible queries into the upper legs, and therefore narrows the amount of information we have to filter to find a more specific and lower level solution. Having said that, understanding that there is great benefit to asking both low and high level questions is a useful perspective that I wish I had earlier in my days of physical inquiry. It is very easy to become lost in the quantum details of movement and exercise, e.g. how many sets, rep, calories, arbitrary metrics, and forget that at the highest level you are just moving. And if you listen to your body and your emotional intelligence while asking questions, you will see that just moving will often be an apt form of inquiry to your questions. And if you require or want to find more detail on specific lower level inquiries, the internet is a great resource, but try to learn first with your primary sense organs before delving into the cognitive catacombs of the English language, for what is lost in translation can often be found through movement. Context. We've established that I, and probably most people most of the time, know pretty much nothing. We've looked at the perspective of high-level and low-level questions and their application to physical inquiry. Now I want you to ask yourself first, if you will accept my apology for a totally misleading title that unveiled nothing about neuroscience or biomechanics, then what was the last question you asked and answered with your body? And what did you find out? What was the last movement you copied from someone else, and what was your inquiry process? Did you ask questions, emulate observations, etc.? Have you ever asked a question and become lost in the lower high-level details? How did you find your way to a reasonable level of inquiry? Part 2. Be adaptable. Chapter 3. Kinesthetic politics. Undoubtedly, adaptability is the number one meta skill to develop for anything involving being a living complex system, aka human being. Adaptability in evolutionary terms refers to the ability of an organism to explore and exploit. That means it's able to recognize and take opportunities and make systematically effective use of the successful ones. You might have to try 100 fruits to find the one that tastes nice, exploration. But once you find it, you should continue to eat that same fruit more times, exploitation. Otherwise, the exploration would be pretty worthless. So let us apply that same model of fitness and behavior to movement and thus exercise. Once we have discovered movement that benefits us and that we enjoy, we should seek to systematically leverage it for good. However, if we have not discovered a realm of movement that is both beneficial and enjoyable, my argumentative perspective is that we should continue to explore, and that applies to both movement as a sport or dance, as well as to the individual movements themselves, which brings us to kinesthetic politics. That is the political aspects of movement and thus exercise. Why are some moves labelled in the way they are, and can someone create a movement or merely discover it? Are there a finite number of movements or infinite? Says who? The fifth concept I'm going to talk on with regards to kinesthetic politics is pattern and form. A movement pattern could be derived from a movement form, and a movement form could be derived from a movement pattern. For example, if we take a cartwheel in gymnastics, it has a strict form and is labelled a cartwheel by specific isolated standards. However, in capoeira, a Brazilian martial art and dance, a cartwheel or ao, apologies if using wrong terminology in either of these sports, is more of a movement pattern. That is, it can be viewed as a composition of smaller movements in themselves. Seeing the cartwheel as a movement pattern enables one to explore different variations in the subcomponents of said pattern. In the same way, one can change the laces on one's shoes without changing the shoes. If one is to change one's shoes, by default, the laces will be changed. However, this prevents one from exploring the opportunities in one's own shoes, and this is why the kinesthetic politics are important. For example, if a gymnast sees a breakdancer or capoeirista executing a movement that looks to be by their label a cartwheel, but with bent legs, they may be partial to bias in their judgment of the movement based on their rigorous standard form. In gymnastics, the cartwheel does not have bent legs in the form, and therefore the movement form is violated by many of the near-infinite variations seen by breakdancers and capoeiristas. But then is the breakdancer or capoeirista doing a cartwheel or just doing a different move entirely? Well, if more of the movement, let's say 80%, is similar to the cartwheel form and 20% different, it is more than reasonable to say that this is a movement variation of the cartwheel form. However, if there are multiple variations that share a high percentage of similarity and a low percentage of disparity, then mathematically this pattern is not a form. I have seen the kinesthetic politics often at play in sports and dance, and as a result there is a great detriment to the creative freedom and thus enjoyment one can derive from the movements. For example, people claim to have invented moves rather than discovered them. This leads to them identifying with such movements and isolating their practice according to their style. It also often results in conflict with others when they copy or buy their style. However, if someone discovers a movement pattern, they may mistake this pattern for a form and accuse anybody of plagiarism making use of the same pattern. This can then lead other practitioners to isolate their movement freedom because of fear of being a copycat. That is a ridiculous sentiment, and unfortunately it persists in the world of dance, especially breakdancing. There are so many possible variations of a movement pattern that millions of forms can be created from patterns. To distinguish the difference between a pattern and a form is left to intuitive and social reasoning. If you feel that movement is too unoriginal, you feel that you are emulating, and if everybody says it's unoriginal, you feel that you're plagiarizing. Unfortunately, this mentality and perspective is what unambiguously separates myself from most sports and forms of dance. I bitterly and vehemently despise the notion that originality can be reduced down to anything other than a mathematically resolved statistical model, i.e. how similar things are under the observation of clearly defined variables such as speed, directionality, etc. The real world is riddled with unique contexts, with each context having unique properties, and if we moved around afraid of copying people, we would never learn to walk or talk as children. Conversely, if we only copied people, we would never discover anything new. It is incumbent, then, that we explore movement patterns and not only movement forms. Movement patterns are less reducible than movement forms are, and therefore permit more creative freedom and less isolation. I argue that this freedom creates more depth in proprioception and kinesthetic awareness, how you move your body, because of the way it enforces adaptability. Gymnastics and gymnasts are very strong and incredible athletes, but they're trained for form. Activities that positively encourage movement patterns include contact martial arts, improvisational movements such as dance and climbing. In contact martial arts or boxing, you have to physically react to the uncertain stimuli of a moving person. This creates a dynamic that cannot be trained in form alone, e.g. hitting a static target. In improvisational dance, there may be a physical reaction to emotion or music, or to people as well, that introduces uncertainty and therefore adaptation. In climbing, the climbing walls or surfaces change unless you climb the same thing constantly, and that encourages adaptation in the movement. Having said that, form should also be respected within the movement systems that are patterns. For example, if we see the cartwheel form as an caporistas, then practicing the different variations whimsically will also probably lead to injury and poor biomechanical habits. Therefore, it is worth labeling movement forms, if for nothing else, but to remember them, and it is worth even arbitrarily labeling patterns. The main fundamental point, however, is to hold the open-minded perspective that patterns and forms can be derived from each other, and it is thus ridiculous to modify our movement behaviours, ergo exercise, based on the politics of anything anyone thinks or says. To hold this political perspective requires one to also relinquish one's own credit for creating movement, as the implicit suggestion is that movement can only be discovered and not created. And in the same way, one cannot possess wind, earth, or fire, one cannot possess movement. Therefore, to claim that you have created a movement is as ridiculous as to say that you have copied speaking because you use the same words as other people. The notion of originality is a social construct, and the argument herein is that you will find more creative freedom and enjoyment from playing with movement patterns and forms than from having or copying style. Alt plus F4 in your movement ego and training yourself to resist the movement egos of others will enhance your freedom and decrease isolation. It is up to you now to decide the boundaries of these criteria for yourself. Context. We have looked at the difference between movement patterns and movement forms. We've considered the relationship between freedom and isolation in the perspective of movement. Now reflect yourself. A movement pattern is a way of moving which yields the possibility of multiple similar movements, forms, to be exercised, each being distinct yet identifiably related. So what is one movement pattern you can think of? Label two variations, movement forms, within this pattern. A movement form is a labelled movement with specific criteria that if changed becomes a deviation. What is one movement form that you can think of, and what is a pattern that you could derive from it? E.g. moonwalking, form, dancing moving backwards, pattern. Motivation and output is the sixth concept we are going to look at. Probably this should be number one because it is genuinely the biggest problem a human will face in their endeavours to move and thus exercise. The greatest problem with motivation that I have observed empirically myself is that of honesty. Dishonesty is rampant in humanoid presenting societies, and we all love calling politicians out for their dishonesty. However, the biggest danger of dishonesty is in a room with no mirrors. If we are unhealthy, we don't like to admit it. If we're socially maladaptive, we like to blame others. There is value to this because it protects our sanity by safeguarding our self-esteem. I have seen this sanity crumble first and second hand nonetheless, and I can assure you that it can be far more catastrophic than accepting one's vulnerabilities and working with them. Every human has strengths and weaknesses, and we can leverage our strengths and work on our weaknesses. But regardless of whether we compensate for our weaknesses by leveraging our strengths or work on our weaknesses themselves, the number one thing required to perform is honesty. If you're tired to go to the gym, saying you will go twice tomorrow is stupid. You don't exist tomorrow, you exist now. This is what I always loved about parkour. In parkour, there is just you and the environment and the moment. and the environment is objective, i.e. honest. The opportunities within it are subject to how honest you are with yourself at that moment. If you're not honest with yourself, you will injure yourself. And if you're honest with yourself, you will have an unlimited playground to playfully move in and enjoy exercising. If you have no arms, saying you're going to become a hand model is not ambitious. It is a downright lie to yourself. As such, I would like to express a perspective on the matter. A simple formula you can get tattooed on your eyeballs. Reality equals honesty minus delusion. It's important to remember this because often honesty is painful and threatening to our self-esteem. So instead of accepting our flaws and working with them, it's much easier to pretend they do not exist. This behavior is unsustainable and removes the real rejoice of self-acceptance and authentic development. Therefore, it is incumbent that we seek to increase our honesty and decrease our delusion. The way we will not have unsustainable, repressed emotions or imminent failure with every goal we set out to achieve with movement. Parkour is fantastic for subtracting delusion because the delusion will tend to get injured pretty early on and either learn humility from the mistakes or quit the activity. It took me 14 years to quit the activity, and so I was humbled a lot by it. I mean, there's only so much you can blame and ascribe blame to a concrete object every time you fall on it. Having said that, there are more efficient ways to increase your honesty and decrease delusion through movement, and that is expectation management. I would argue from experience that stimulation is better than expectation. Your friend Elon Musk once said, not sure where he plagiarized it from, that happiness is reality minus expectations. There's some laudable truth to that statement, but how do we then manage our expectations? My empirical experience suggests stimulation. Whenever we are stimulated, we forget about the variables we are trying to change. For example, two people making love aren't counting calories, and someone dancing at a concert isn't optimizing time under tension for muscular contraction. That's because they are stimulated. Much like the argument for focus and enjoyment, I have a perspective from experience that stimulation is a far better motivator for output than expectations. When we expect something, we focus on one thing. The thing that we want, and this can contradictorily distract us from the task we need to do to actually get the thing we want. Conversely, the mere act of doing things, moving, can yield the things we want without thinking about them at all. This is a very powerful perspective and an important one to remember. In my experience, optimism is less about making the right decisions as it is about having the right reactions. We can't predict reality, but we can change how we react to it, hence stoicism. Having said that, moving aimlessly can also be detrimental and equally unfulfilling. So where is the balance between dilly-dallying and micromanagement? Purpose. Having a purpose is not the same as having a destination. It's more so an abstract sense of why we are doing something generally. Do we enjoy it? Do we want something from it? Expectation. Having a purpose is a great way to create stimulation because it enables us to look up at the stars and dream, but it keeps us far enough away from our goals that we do not become blinded by an indulgence in our desires. So how do we leverage stimulation and purpose for motivation? Stimulation is a very hard thing to identify because the very essence of stimulation is the consumption of our attention. While our attention is wholly consumed, we are therefore distracted from the metacognition required to identify the very thing that is stimulation itself. Personally, I use a lot of lame ways to generate this stimulation. They may be different for every individual, but the main thing is to try remembering what activities and movements made you forget about everything while you were doing them. That is stimulation. For me personally, my ADHD brain responds really well to short timers, less than 90 seconds, because it's enough time for me to feel like I can be effective, but a short enough time for me to know that I can put 100% effort and focus in without having to count repetitions or having time to care what people around me think. As for movement itself, having mirrors such as in dance studios can be another great stimulation. That way you can visually appreciate the art of your movement and the aesthetic of your unique human doing them. The great thing about observing your movement in the mirror is that you can see your unique human and come to appreciate the unique ways that you move through space. Again, however, the key is to find what stimulates you and focus on these movements and activities rather than following your expectations and desires. As with any mathematical problem, there are many solutions to the same problem, and if a particular solution is not up for motivating you to produce output, it's worth exploring and exploiting other activities. You do not need to motivate yourself to exercise if you can enjoy moving. Context. We've considered the necessity of honesty and humility in movement and the benefit of focusing on stimulation over expectation. We've talked about achieving goals serendipitously without seeking to, versus failing to achieve goals by focusing on them. We've talked about purpose and expectation management. Now time to reflect. When was the last time you were humbled through movement and how did you react? Did you return to the movement? Did you avoid it or did you focus on something new? What are some movement activities that distract you from things outside of the immediate feedback loop of the activity itself, that being in the moment? And how could you use these to stimulate you to move? What is your purpose for moving, and what are at least 2 ways you can fulfill this purpose through movement? Chapter 4. Counterintuition. Bad habits short-term, good habits long-term. 7th concept. It can seem very counterintuitive to advocate bad habits. However, it is easy to dismiss the impact of duration when regarding habits. For example, a good habit that is short-lived isn't very good at all, and a bad habit that is short-lived might not be very bad at all. Our long-term habits are what's important when it comes to establishing movement habits and thus exercise habits. One of my old friends made me realise this in a story she shared of her heartbreak. I asked her how she dealt with heartbreak, and she said she smoked weed and ate pizza. I naturally responded, astounded by such preposterously lackadaisical behaviours. "What, are you serious, cuz?" Then she elaborated, only for like 2 weeks, and then I got back to normal. I don't know what her normal is. It might be smoking weed and eating ice cream. But this really inspired me. Her way of dealing with short-term trauma was short-term relief, a mechanism that for the majority of humans would lead to addiction. However, in her case, she was emotionally intelligent enough to understand that a short-term bad habit could revert to a long-term gain, recovering from the heartbreak and reintegrating healthier habits. As such, I believe that the same method could be applied to movement in a variety of ways. For example, on the long term, it might be a terrible habit to eat ice cream after engaging in intensive movement and thus exercise. However, if you can leverage this bad habit to encourage you to exercise, then the abundance of benefits from the exercise will also increase the motivation to exercise. It might not appease your desire for ice cream, but a little bit of something is better than a lot of nothing. Although you are forming a bad habit to form a good habit, the good habit might have more benefit over the long term than the bad habit over the short term. Obviously, there are boundaries to this, and it's up to you to have your own judgment and rationality about how bad the habit can be and for how long. I profoundly advise against substance abuse, but if you're already engaging in substance abuse or comfort eating, there's a body of literature saying that self-acceptance and forgiveness are better mechanisms for recovery than self-loathing. So I'm not going to say you are a fool. It is what it is, but maybe you can leverage that for self-good. I mean, smoking weed after playing basketball is still better than smoking weed alone in your bedroom, and eating pancakes after dancing is still better than eating pancakes without dancing. Having said that, the converse of everything aforementioned also stands. Long-term bad habits are generally not worth short-term good habits. Naturally, this depends on the risk you're willing to take and the cost-benefit. For example, if the short-term bad habit might kill you or severely harm people, it's not worth it. And if the short-term good habit might prevent severe harm, it is probably worth it despite establishing a long-term bad habit. For example, if a short-term good habit is going to the gym every day and you stick to it for a week, but to do so you make a habit of ignoring and dismissing people in your social network, you may cultivate a maladaptive social behaviour that withstands even after you stop going to the gym for the week. Now you can find yourself with long-term trouble of dealing with broken relationships and social skills for a very short-term and short-lived benefit indeed. Alternatively, if the long-term benefit of exercising every day requires you to go through a war zone for the first week, then getting killed on the short term will render the long-term habit redundant anyway. Which may be contrarily argued, saving a family member's life or someone that you love may be worth suffering longer-term harm. My older brother suffered a lot of long-term harm in the neighbourhood we lived in because he stood up for me to protect me from perhaps short-term harm from a gang of trash monkeys. Unfortunately, he had to engage in a lot of sketchy, long-term habits to avoid that trouble. Because of my short-term ignorance of playing around in the area the fools lived in. Big love to my brother Ahmed though. So then how does this apply to movement? Well, besides the motivational example with eating ice cream as a short-term bad habit to instigate the short to long-term habit of exercising, it applies in other mysterious and magical ways. There is an apt word to describe these occasions that goes by the aforementioned name of serendipity. Serendipity is the creation or discovery of something beneficial without the prior intention to do so. Let's relate that to falling. When we move, it's very important that we fail. When we fall or when we fail, we are presented with an experience outside of our expectations, i.e. novelty, and it is in this novelty that we learn and discover. It's an opportunity not only to learn what not to do biomechanically, but also an opportunity to discover new movements. Breakdancing and capoeira are a beautiful space to witness this phenomenon. Oftentimes, breakdancers will make a mistake or fall, and over many experiences training with failure, they will engage with a brand new movement. That is in a lot of cases the creation of a magical movement moment that nobody expected. And that moment feels truly incredible. There is no thought about your goals or weight or caloric deficit or your strength. In that moment, it is just pure ecstasy. As such, I argue here that you engage in routines that permit short-term failure or shortcomings for long-term benefits. A lot of health gurus and experts will disagree, and God bless you, David Goggins, but most of the population, including myself, cannot sustain that level of intensity required to be perfect. So I'm suggesting to accept your flaws and roll with them insofar that they establish more productive, more enjoyable, and healthier habits long-term. On the topic of movement failure and serendipity, I would also like to talk on the perspective of one-way tickets. What I'm trying to express here is the idea of moving in one direction without returning in the opposite direction. Imagine a bicep curl. It is a cliche example of weightlifting, and I have no hate for biceps. If anything, I'm just jealous of the people with bigger arms than me because I'm a little beta babe. But the movement is rather repetitive and involves a repetition of direction. I argue that this repetition of direction is lame, and practicing movements that follow a non-linear course of direction is more enjoyable. Slightly biased, of course, and probably more beneficial for building adaptive kinesthetics because of the constant readjusting of the nervous system, maybe. Scientists sue me. Imagine, for example, doing a cartwheel. In doing a cartwheel, the starting position and the finishing position are the same position. However, the journey from one repetition to the other involves progressive one-way motion. If you cartwheel to the left, you move one way, and as you continue, you complete the movement by fulfilling velocity in one direction. This creates a novel dynamic opportunity to implement other movements into the cartwheel and create non-linear sequences with low movement redundancy, i.e. you can complete a movement course without consecutively repeating the same movement. For example, a cartwheel followed by a roundhouse kick, taekwondo, or tricking is a movement sequence that can be repeated successively in one direction. Each sequence repetition repetition, however, requires the kinesthetic and proprioceptive readjustment of the body to a completely different movement. Hence, it is factually and maybe psychologically more engaging and attention demanding than repeating the same singular movement, or returning from the opposite direction of the movement initiated. In my empirical experience, this is a great way to train reaction time as well, because in order to switch from one movement to the other requires one to readily prepare for the following movement, and by repeating the sequences in a non-linear fashion, you get to move and thus exercise in a highly dynamic kinesthesis. Context. We've reflected on the controversial perspective of leveraging short-term bad habits to create long-term good habits. We've looked at the perspective of failure as an opportunity for serendipity and discovery in movement. We've looked at the perspective of one-way movement sequences and the potential benefit of practicing non-linear movement sequences over repetitions of linear movements. Now, time to reflect. What are your long-term movement habits? Reflect on one good long-term habit and one short-term bad habit. How did they come to be? What has serendipity actually helped you with in your life? Can you relate this to a movement behavior? For example, when you try one movement practice and it happened to benefit you trying another practice, transferability. What are two movement sequences you have practiced in the past? For example, dance steps, punching combinations, swimming strokes, kicking and arm variations through breaststroke sequence, etc. Lifestyle versus life trial is the 8th concept we're going to look at. Lifestyle is a very ambiguous term. It can mean a million different things for 8 billion different people. So let's actually begin by what is meant here with life trial. Life trial is a reference to something which we trial in life and cease to do beyond such trial. This includes all of your New Year's resolutions since you were old enough to start setting them. It also includes things like skydiving for the most people that don't go back. It is really important perspective to hold on to in movement, however, because movements that we only indulge in temporarily can often have transferable benefits to other activities. For example, I have only attended 3 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu lessons, yet the grappling leg hooks that I discovered, or whatever they're called, were immediately transferable to bouldering, and the climbing techniques from my less than 5 bouldering sessions were immediately applicable to my working rope access when I started climbing and working on buildings. I like to refer to this activity as movement tourism, that is experimenting and playing with various different forms of movement cultures and benefiting from the short-term excursions. Of course, you will unlikely reach any competitive or glorious level in any of these activities, but it is astounding how much they transfer to each other. Pretty much any physical activity I start now, I supersede beginner level immediately, even if I do quit 15 seconds later. The argument I would make here, however, is that giving up is better than not starting, and movement tourism can be a great way to have fun, exploiting this ethos in a productive and versatile way. An average habit that is repeated 365 times a year will almost always supersede the progress of movement tourism, and that mastery can feel incredible, beyond the physical benefits it provides you. For example, a meager 10 minutes of focused practice every day will amount to more annual practice hours than a 1-hour session once a week. There is also a great body of literature on the effects of spaced repetition, that is having regular but dynamically spaced out learning intervals rather than big chunky sessions with long stand-down periods. As such, there is a great argument to be made for the benefit of implementing movement practice into lifestyle rather than life trial. That is not to say that life trial is not fun and the movement tourism isn't beneficial, but rather that it might be wise to prioritize the majority of your efforts on lifestyle and a recreational exploratory minority on movement tourism. That brings us to the notion of giving up. A lot of people, including myself, are afraid to try something because of the fear of failure or fear we will give up. But that is okay. It is really better to give up than to not start. You learn nothing from avoidance, but you learn a lot from movement, even if the movement is a small step out of your comfort zone. When I was around 15, I had a weird agoraphobia and panic disorder episode. I'd recently been violently robbed in the street, and it may or may not have been related, but I was afraid to leave my home for several months. It was awful. I felt completely out of control, afraid of everything, and it took so much effort just to take that one step out of the house and immediately return. I figured, what is the point of walking 2 meters out of the house only to return again with the same fears and emotional dismay? This was a fallacy in my own reasoning. Eventually, I pushed myself to expand those 2 meters into walking up and down the street, then around the block, then to the bus stops, and so on. In fact, this habit eventually became an enjoyable pastime that came to make me feel independent, self-reliant, and adventurous. Much beyond my expectation, my fears did not subside linearly, and I ended up going to Russia alone several times and traveling far beyond my comfort zone. Initially, I had figured that walking 2 meters would not help me get anywhere I wanted to be, so for a long time I didn't bother starting. I was afraid, but the numerous times I had panic attacks far from home and had to give up and run home, they each taught me something new about my relationship with my mind and the environment, and how to evaluate real danger versus perceived danger, how to adapt my body to the physical phenomena that I'd never seen before, and how to utilize and build on my existing movement patterns to survive and socialize. At the time of writing this book, I've recently traveled far beyond my comfort zone. The last 10 days have seen lavish indulgence, a devastating natural disaster, and a potential migration across the globe or to jail. I have no idea where I'll be next month, but all I know is that the rewards for movement are abundant, and it's far better to give up on your journey than to never have started it. And with that said, let us conclude this short book. Context. We've looked at the difference between lifestyle and life trial. Life trial being the temporary engagement with something, and lifestyle being the integration into one's routine and regular behaviour. Relating this to movement practice through movement tourism and movement mastery through space repetition. We reflected on giving up versus not trying and the benefit of trying and giving up even when it feels meaningless. We've looked at the benefit of transferability from frequent and different movement activities and balancing a lifestyle between routine practice and exploration. So let's ask some questions. What are some movement activities you have tried and stopped doing that you enjoyed, and what did you enjoy about it/them? How could the concept of movement tourism be implemented to encourage adaptability and adventure in your movement and thus exercise practice? What is the maximum time you can commit to mastery? For example, 5 minutes a day for 1 week, 2 hours a week for 1 year. How could you experiment with your commitment threshold to build and enjoy mastery of some, not all, movement practices that you participate in or wish to participate in? Conclusion. Rather than recap the entirety of the book, I know that humans are nothing without instruction, but as much as I would love to provide you with a magical call to action that will change your life, there is more wisdom to be gained by the questions that we ask than in the answers that we find. Rather than leave you empty-handed, however, I will ask you 2 questions. Why have you read this book this far? And how can you use these perspectives considered to help you in your own life of movement? The end.